Hello and welcome everyone to CRM MVP podcast episode number 110. My name is Gus and I'm actually hosting this episode with Gustav Westerlund, fellow MVP. Gustav, welcome to the show
Thank you very
yet
much.
again. I love having you on the show because, I've always said that there's a small group of MVPs that actually get to implement dynamics for a living. A lot of MVPs are running their own business or being amazing developers, and we actually get to implement dynamics for customers out there. The questions that you hear in conferences from customers and stuff like that, especially the concerns they have, I'm always curious to get your take on because, well, you do this for a living, and I get to hear what is it that you're hearing out there, and whether that is something that is I'm only hearing from my customers and prospects, or is this a global thing? And by going to the UG Summit a few weeks ago, or at this point about a month and a half ago, one of the things that kept coming up was the whole thing with this API call limits, right? People were very, very concerned about hitting those API limits, and especially when it comes to moving into Power Apps, understanding the difference between the allocations that you get in terms of APIs for let's say a full Dynamics 365 enterprise license versus a Power App per app license, for example, which is way
Mm,
smaller,
mm.
right? So I wanted to bring you on the show so we can talk about this. And we've been meaning to do this for a while. We've actually talked about doing that, but we decided to wait till Ignite because things get announced during Ignite. And I'm glad we did, right? Because things changed and we want to bring obviously the latest and greatest. And by the way, this can change on the next conference. But at least we
Maybe,
get to
yeah.
talk about what they announced at Ignite. And, it doesn't have to be a super long episode. I just want to kind of tell, all the facts about
Yeah.
API calls, what Microsoft is doing, what are they for, why do they intend to do with this thing. And I think this will also connect with the next episode, which is there's something else I want to talk to you about, but we'll leave this one for the next episode. But for now, let's do a quick introduction, Gustav. I know you've been on the show a few times, but what is it that you do? Where do you work? And just talk a little bit about yourself.
So I live outside Stockholm and I work in Stockholm, Sweden. And that's not a state of the US, but it's a country in Europe, um, in case anybody
Okay.
wondered. And I've started my own consultancy 2010, and now we're about 27 people.
Nice.
I stepped down as CEO so I can continue working with the systems I love. I'm a real tech nerd, so I love working with technology. And I think it was Matt Whitman who sort of once said that he's also an MVP, and he once said that, Gustav, you always like you drill down into one subject until it's like you find all the different angles of it. In that case, I think we were discussing GDPR or something like that. I'm still haven't met the bottom of GDPR. I think it's hard to do that. um,
Bottomless pit.
but now I've sort of like dug myself into this hole, which is the API entitlements part and also the API service protections. And I
Hmm.
think maybe we should start there and just like explain the difference between these two different concepts,
Right.
because I so often hear people confuse them. Even Microsoft support confuses them. So don't be surprised if, for instance, the account managers for a customer or your partner contact at Microsoft, they don't know the
Yeah.
difference between
Just
these two.
because they work for Microsoft or they're a Microsoft partner doesn't mean that they understand it. And before we get into the differences between those two, because even though there's a lot of people that are concerned about API calls and they know what they are, some people listening to this show have no idea what we're talking about, right?
Yep,
They have enterprise or maybe they have on-prem where it doesn't matter.
yep.
And they're like, what are these guys talking about? So why don't you explain really quick what API calls are?
Yeah, so the API calls or API requests are it's only relevant for the online version of Dynamics, first of all.
Hmm.
So if you have on-prem, you don't have to, you can stop listening right now, I think. Well, if you like, it's always good to know maybe for the future if you're trying to move to the cloud, because then you have to take these things into consideration. And if you have integrations that are extremely talkative, then you will be hit by this. So,
Yeah.
um, and then you have to start understanding what a request is from the entitlement perspective, particularly, but maybe from the other perspective of API service protections as well. A request is every time you do something to the platform, more or less, from a particular message. So, for instance, if you create an account, that is one request or call, and if you read 5 accounts to a list, that's one call as well. So reads you can actually read up to 5,000 in one single call. So reads are not that hard as, for instance, a create or delete is.
Unless you open a record, then it will be one read for one record, right? But
yes, of course.
But essentially, what you said is right. An API call is like a fancy name for an action, for doing something in Dynamics, reading something, creating something, deleting something, whatever it is. And whether a person does it manually by double clicking on a record to open it, or a workflow creates the record, it doesn't matter how it's done. As long as it's done, it counts as an API call.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So that's also important. And I think that the important thing here is that it's actually not what's hitting the front end of the API, but it's actually the underlying sort of architecture of what's hitting Dataverse in that structure. So that you have to remember what they're actually counting. And this is important for several reasons. One reason is that if you, for instance, call a delete or an assign, there are cascading rules that are based on relationships, and those can actually trigger rather large cascade behaviors from one table to the next, to the next, to the next. And so maybe you do one assign, and that actually does 15 assigns, or even 100 assigns if you really.
If you, 1,000 API calls. Who knows?
Yeah, so it's hard to know, and that you can't get into those situations. So it's important to understand that. Also, I've heard a lot of people saying, "Oh, but it's fine. I'll just do batching." Batching means that you package several calls into one, and then you send them. So you can batch 10 API calls into one batch, and you send them. And this is very advantageous from a performance perspective if you're doing large operations. However, from an API entitlement perspective, it is not that advantageous, because if you package 10 create calls in one batch, that's actually counted as 11 calls, because there's one call to unpack the package, the batch, and then you have
it's worse.
Create. Yeah, so it's actually worse. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, for sure. So essentially, the reason why these were why this is a thing is because Microsoft started thinking a couple years ago about how it wasn't fair that everyone kind of paid the same price for Dynamics, whether it was a user that logged in twice a year to check, some reports, or someone who was heavily running integrations and stuff like that, or was being used for integration. So a company that had 5 users could be using Dynamics way more than a company have 500, right? So Microsoft said, look, we want to start invoicing, or we want to start probably charging for Dynamics, kind of like how electricity works, or like how Azure works, right? Where the more you use it, the more you pay. And for the money that you're paying, we're going to give you some entitlements. We think that, if you're paying $95 for a user license per month, then you're going to get X amount of API calls that you can use that we believe is fair use for you. But if you're abusing it, then you should pay more, because we're going to have to upgrade our servers and our infrastructure and our network and all of that to support these massive companies. And what was happening before is that the companies that don't really need all that massive infrastructure are paying to pay for other companies to use the infrastructure, right? So they are financing that. So Microsoft is saying, okay, enough is enough. The companies that need a lot pay a lot. Companies that don't need a lot pay, what's fair. That's essentially where that came from. Now, until now, Gustav, and before we get into the entitlements and the requests and all of that stuff, how is Microsoft monitoring this? Because this started like 2 years ago. I'm trying to remember when they started even showing through your organization insights and through some mechanisms that you can use to check out your API calls. Right now is through the administration center and the Power Platform. You can check that. But what is Microsoft doing in terms of monitoring that, and asking people or like warning people if they're going too high or whatever?
Well, currently they're not warning people because they haven't actually put this into operation. What they've said now in the message that was released during Ignite was that they will start warning people 6 months after they have released this new report that's going to be released in a few months. So we're probably seeing that.
Someday.
I would expect it maybe someday, like some around some January, February time. I think that for that report, and then they're going to start um, enforcing the entitlements in the matter in the same kind of way they have with the gigabyte or the storage overshoots. So their admins will start getting spams if you overshoot a lot, saying
Yep.
that you haven't done your stuff, you haven't paid for what you actually use.
Yep.
Then they have said that they reserve the right to later on go further than that, but
Hmm.
currently they will not. So I think that's probably up to what level you'll see. And so another thing that they're saying is also that they have tried the new um, limits that they have set are based on the fact that maybe like 95% of the instances or
Metrics.
tenants
Yeah.
should not be affected. They should just
Right.
be able to buy the normal licenses and just use the system, and they don't have to think about this. So this is really for the type of customers that you mentioned that have like 5 users and they have like built massive amounts of integration, have huge amounts of data. Those types of organizations are typically the ones that need to pay more because they are using more, and
Yeah.
hence, yeah. So it's that's why it's there. So for the 95% normal instances, you don't really have to worry about it.
All right. So Microsoft is tracking these APIs at two levels, right? They have the request and then they have the service side of it. Can you talk about those two things and what do they mean?
Yeah, so the requests are measured from two different perspectives. The one we've been talking mostly about now is like you should pay your fair share. That's what's called the entitlements or API entitlements, and they are measured over 24 period time, so like per day.
24 hours a day. Yep.
Yes. So if you have large integrations, you might have 3 million API calls per day. That's I have customers that have that,
Yeah.
and then the other side of this, which is also which has been in place for some time now, that's the API service protection, which is also called throttling, and this is it's actually 3 different throttles, and they're measured on a rolling 5 window perspective. So if you breach like you use the API too much, then you will just get an exception from the API saying you have overshot your what you're allowed to do. Please back off for 4 minutes.
Hmm.
And that's the API throttling. And there's no way to actually buy your way to more power. You can typically raise a ticket with a Microsoft support and ask them to raise it. I've done that for several times, which has been successful. And they can raise it because, for instance, if you're doing migrations and you want to sort of get the data in there, then they can fix that for you.
Right.
There's typically not a way to sort of buy your way out of that problem, at least not within the normal licensing experience, as it's called by Microsoft. Um, so I think those two different aspects are important to understand, because sometimes when you talk to Microsoft, they will say, "Oh, but it's just the throttling. That's not a problem. You can just use more users and so on, and you will get around it." Because that's actually true, and you can use, if you want to go, if you're throttled, you can add more users. You can switch off what's called the affinity cookie and so on. But I don't think we should go into that in this session, because I think this session should be more on the entitlement, and I'd be happy
Right.
to come back and talk more about those things later if you like, and how to sort of some tips on how to use the API in a performant way.
Yeah.
Um,
I think most customers are concerned about, what if it's 3 p.m. and I just hit my API limit, as a user or whatever? Like, what's going to happen next? Like, should I be worried about it? And a lot of my customers, the problem is that in a lot of cases, it's hard to know, like, it's hard to plan. Like at least with storage, I feel like if you're going from, let's say, from on-prem to online, if you're going from on-prem to online, storage is always that concern because companies just store unlimited data. Like they don't care because hard drives are cheap. So you end up with like 100 gigs of data for like a 20 user implementation, which they're not gonna get near any of that storage online. So now you have to stuff like a pillow inside a shoebox, and it's hard, right? But it's something that I can predict. Like I can look at the data and be like, okay, you guys have leads that are 10 years old. Let's only upload the last 2 years or whatever. And let's use SharePoint for documents instead of putting attachments. Like there's ways around that. But when it comes to API calls, there's not a whole lot that you can do to predict that. So I feel like a lot of customers are concerned about that. Not only that it's harder to predict it, what every user will need, but also what's going to happen if the limits are hit.
Well, as Microsoft has said, it's currently nothing will happen if you, except for like angry emails.
Right.
But nothing will happen at this time. But they do reserve the right to, which they always do, of course, have the right to sort of change. They don't really have to. They don't really have to write that down. But now they've explicitly said that they do have the right to sort of change this in the future. And I think that if they still see that people are abusing it, they will probably start enacting some kind of harder enforcement of that. But that's not the case at this time.
Right.
So I think that's important.
Now, in Dynamics or in the Power Platform, we have several kinds of users, right?
Mm-hmm.
And companies have been using several kinds of users for a long time. I think non-interactive user accounts, for example, have been around for as long as I can remember with Dynamics 365 Online. So if you're a user, depending on who you are, depending on your license, you get different entitlements, right? So do you have the numbers on hand, like to talk about enterprise and professional?
Sure.
And yeah.
So this is one of the good things as well about the revised thing they did over Ignite is that they made it simpler. So now, before there was lots of like variations on this. Now you will have, if you have a user that has the Power Apps per user or higher license, meaning any Dynamics license, for instance, then you will get that user will be entitled to 40,000 calls per day. And
that's awesome.
That's a lot. And I think the only way to sort of actually hit that ceiling is using, for instance, writing a flow that does a lot of things during that day. With maybe actually using some advanced functionality in that to be able to generate
you would have to like go banana. I mean, if you work 8 hours a day, don't take any breaks and lunch. That's 5,000 actions an hour. It's like there's a lot. 40,000 is a lot.
Yes, so I don't think that you will never be able to do it by just using the API. But if you start making flows or you have some other integration that's running on this particular user, then you can risk hitting this.
You could.
Yeah, and then for the like first party apps team members, like the sales team member, and also the Power Apps per app license, you will get 6,000 calls.
Okay.
So they're smaller, and I think that's also important to understand, because if you have a user that will be very will use the system a lot, it might just be better to just buy a Power Apps per user license for them, so that instead of having a per app,
which is $20 a month, right, for the full price in the US, at least. I don't know how it is in Europe, but or in Australia and everywhere else, but it's $20 a month for 40,000 API calls a day. I think that 6,000 is realistic. I think that if you give a per app license to a user, that user is not going to be running a bunch of flows and a bunch of other stuff. They're going to be doing a task. And that's still a lot. I mean, it's almost 1,000 calls an hour, 1,000 creates, reads, writes. Like it's a lot. So I think that this can go even higher than 95% of customers. I think 99% of users out there will not be near any of these numbers.
Yeah. Okay. So
and they're not being enforced. On top of
that. Exactly. And I also think, but I think the important thing here is that the best practice for Microsoft of doing integrations is to not use these users.
Correct.
So there's a separate part of entitlements that are relating to the non-licensed users, and the
Yeah.
non-licensed users are admin users, which have just called administrative access.
Mhm.
So that can be a normal user in the system, but they can't access the actual
Yeah, if you make a
business
global
side.
admin, if you make a global admin in Office 365, even without giving them a Dynamics license, they'll be able to log in. They won't see any data, but they'll be able to do customization and stuff. They'll be a system admin in
Yeah,
Dynamics.
yeah, and they can add users and give them security roles and stuff like that.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that's an admin user. Then there's what's called a non-interactive users, and these are normal users where you click a button on the user card saying I want this to be a non-interactive user, and then you can remove the license from them, and you can still use that user from the APIs.
Yep.
Um,
It's for
but
it's for not humans. So for integrations and
yes,
anything that is an automatic process behind the scenes. Yeah.
yeah, but the important thing is to understand that they are not really what you're supposed to be using for integrations. They are more there for a legacy, like supporting some kind of legacy applications, so
That's
that
right.
you don't have to have a paid license to do integrations. And there is also a limit to them that you can't
It
have
is It is painful though to see how many people, how many companies out there have their integrations running with like an administrator, like a regular user who's a system admin paying full price for the license, right?
yeah,
We work with a customer right now that their previous partner implemented Scribe for them, and they told them the only way Scribe would work is with a paid user, right? So they are, limited to 40,000 calls a day, and they don't have an application user or anything like that. And maybe it's true. I don't know. I don't know Scribe that much. I know that Scribe is not. It's probably not going to be around Dynamics for a long time. But it was interesting to see how many
mm,
people out there are still using regular user accounts for the integrations.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then you just mentioned the third type here is the application
Application
users.
users. Yep.
They're also sometimes called service principals. There's there's just variations or on exactly what you mean. These are what Microsoft recommend for using integrations to Dynamics. Um, in the report that you can get out that will be released once it's sort of regarding this, you will actually see the usage per application user. So what I do recommend is that you try. They're free to create, so there's no actual cost from a licensing
Is there a
perspective.
limit, Gustav, on application
No,
users?
not that
Okay,
I'm aware
because
of.
for
No.
non-interactive users, I think we have three or
Yeah.
five. I'm trying to remember, but you have a
I
limit.
think it's five, but I think they're trying to move away from them. And when telemetry says that the effects won't be affecting too many users, they will just switch them off. So I would strongly recommend that everybody moves their integrations to application
Application.
users or
That's
service
right.
principals. So uh, that's the important part of that as well. So they're better, and you should be try to granularize your integration. So don't reuse your application users. It's not really an entitlement perspective, but it will be easier to see later on. Like if you have 5 applications that are using the same user, and then you just look at how many calls are coming in. It's like, oh, but it's 4 million. And you can't really see which of these 5 applications are causing that. But if you actually had 5 different application users that are using for each of one of the systems, then it will be easier to see that it's actually this system that's causing like 4.5 million of these calls, and the other ones are like just 100,000 each or something like that. And then you can start
Right.
working on the one that's the problem. You don't have to go too hard
So, so what is the entitlement for application users? Let's talk about that because this is interesting.
Yeah, so they first they changed it, so they went from 100,000 to 500,000 for the base, and then they also added that you will get 5,000 extra per larger type of user, if you just say it that way,
So
not an
power
application.
apps per user and higher, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
Right.
that's what you will get from that. So it's that means that if you have 100 users in like sales professional users, for instance, that you will get 500,000 plus 100 times 5,000, meaning
Another 500,000, yeah.
yeah.
So you get a
So
whole million of API calls
yeah,
per day. Now,
yeah.
it's not per account, right? This is just for, are all accounts pulling from this number, or is it per account, or what's the
So
the
all
catch?
all the all the non-licensed users are using this pool for the
Right,
entire tenant, not per instance.
right.
So just that's something that's important. Especially I've seen some larger corporations where they, and I have one of these customers as well, where they have like one tenant for Sweden, one tenant for that company, one tenant for this company, and so on. So they have like lots of different companies within this large corporation
Mm-hmm.
or enterprise, and they share tenant. These will definitely be some of the customers that will be having problems with this, I will presume, because it's these you're using the entire tenant all the time.
Yeah,
So I think that's something that they really need to sort of at least beware of this.
yeah.
If they have
I
not
think
that,
the challenge with numbers like that, 100,000, 500,000, is that they are, before they announce the increase on a per user basis. Before they announce that, it was a flat number, so like 100,000, and that was the same whether you had 10,000 users or 10 users,
mm,
right? Which was a challenge. So I like the fact that they now increased it based on the number of users that you have. So
yes, yeah,
that's good. Um, but I still think that for some companies this can be a challenge, especially companies that have a low number of users but high amounts of data, like accounting firms and stuff like that.
mm,
They have so much data, but they have few employees. You
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah. We will see those types of customers, of course. But I mean, I think that we might come back to that later, but I think part of this might be refactoring, that they can be solved by refactoring, and that doesn't mean it's easy refactoring, but
right?
it can be solved through refactoring, and I can discuss some of those concepts a bit later on in this episode as well. But just to mention the last thing about the non-licensed users entitlements, that is
Yes,
that there's a cap for 10 million, meaning if you have 50,000 users, you will still just
that's
get
a
10 million.
lot,
Yeah, you will still just get 10 million.
right?
But what they are saying is that do contact your Microsoft representative, and we will discuss this. If you have 50,000 users, what I think between the lines, what they're saying is that there's a way around it. if you are that big,
Yeah,
yeah. So
because once you hit 2,000 users, that is 10 million at a 5,000 rate or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think that for these big customers, I don't think it's going to be so much of a concern. I do believe that these numbers would satisfy 99% of customers out there. I mean, most companies don't use 40,000 API calls a day or on a user basis, or for the ones that are perhaps 6,000 a day, or for an integration, you don't get to see 1 million a day in most companies. Are there companies that do multiple million a day? Sure, but this is not a limit that most companies run into, at least
no,
based on my own experience.
I agree,
Right,
and I think some of the companies that have these problems are typically have very intense integrations, like typically business to consumer type of companies that get lots of data from other systems pushed into Dynamics all the time.
right.
And there might be different types of changes. I have a customer working with it's a travel agency, and they get like all updates every time a flight is changed 5 minutes. All the people on that flight will have to will get their orders updated. So it's like boom, 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 lots of things happening. A lot,
500 API calls, 1,000
yeah.
API calls. Yeah,
And so the problem with these things as well is that if you were like 2 years ago or 5 years ago built an integration,
hmm,
nobody talked about that there would be some kind of limitation from this perspective.
right. It
So
was unlimited.
yes, and I think that important thing is sometimes people start blaming partners for not taking this into consideration when they built an application or an integration 5 years ago. There is no way
That
that
is true.
partner could know this.
That is
So
true.
don't blame the partner, because it's that's not really fair. The partner,
That is true.
they're trying to make this well, they should anyway, be making it as efficient as they can based on the rules that are set at that time and that they could possibly know. But there was no way that somebody from 5 years ago could possibly know that this was
Right.
coming. So
Right. We didn't know either. Like, and I tell, our customers that one of the advantages of having an MVP is that we get to see in the future, right? We get to see what Microsoft is working on. Some of this stuff we can't really tell anyone because we're under NDA, but we can steer the customer away from having to redo this thing a year from now or whatever, because we get to see what's coming, right?
yeah.
But this stuff, I mean, 5 years ago, like you said, we had no idea. 5 years ago, we weren't talking about API calls, right?
Mm.
Which is interesting. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I'm curious to see where this thing is gonna go. Are they gonna start enforcing it, and who's going to be affected by it? You say you have customers that might be getting hit by this, right? What?
They are going to get hit by this. I think even if we
100%.
even if we do like massive refactoring,
Yeah.
and to try to do smart things, we're so far above this that it's like
Yeah.
it's almost funny. But it's not funny because they have to pay for it. So, and then the thing is that that's the last thing that we haven't mentioned about this is that if you are over the limit, so let's say that you have 1 million entitlements for your application users, and you're using 2 million.
Yeah.
Then you have to buy an additional SKU or license that has it was actually revoked, the old one, and from the information that I have, it's the new one is going to be placed at the same cost, but instead of adding 10,000 per unit, you will actually get 50,000 API calls per unit,
Nice.
and it's yeah. So they've reduced the price to about 20%, which is great. And then that will cost $50 per month.
Hmm.
So if you need to, then you can just do the math yourself of how many. If
Yeah.
you go from 1 million to 2 million, how many more of these do you need?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that's good that they're going to be introducing that. Like, okay, if you need to go higher, go higher. But I do, going back to the comment that you made, which is in some cases, some customers are going to have to redo their integrations, rethink
Mm.
their integrations and all of that, because they were made 5 years ago when this wasn't a concern. The challenge with that stuff, and I think this affects you too, is that in the best case scenario, um, one of these projects is going to cost a lot of money, and the best case scenario is that the users don't tell the difference. It's like nothing changes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I agree.
Those projects are always so tough to talk about. When you go to a customer and you say, okay, it's going to be $100,000 to do this thing, and hopefully you won't tell the difference. Like, it's the worst conversation, right? To
I know,
have.
but I think, but in for this company I'm working with, what we did was that I had a very good conversation with the product owner, and he's very open. So what we did, I just showed him, like, this is what's going to happen, and this is the cost that you're going to be seeing if we don't do anything about this.
Yeah.
And both from an API perspective and a storage capacity, because they're using a lot of storage as well. And then we were looking at, okay, so how good can possibly, in a reasonable perspective, a refactoring do? What can that do for us? And then we can say, okay, that's the actual business case that we have. But it's of course very hard in a very early stage to say, okay, we can reduce the API cost by 50%. We can maybe reduce storage by 50%, and so on. So it's very hard to say that, but we sort of try to just say something like that, saying this is probably what we can do, because based on what we know of the integrations, of how they're made and so on, and how chatty they are. So I think that's probably a good idea to start, and then just tell the truth, the honest truth to the customer, but about, I mean, this is what Microsoft are building, and it's there for making things more fair, and from a pricing perspective, and obviously they don't think that the way we are using the system is fair at this time. So
Right.
if we want to keep on doing that, we will have to pay for that, and this is the business case. So if you want, we can make a project, they can change the system in this and that way, and that will actually cause a reduction in the API calls and a reduction in capacity that's being used and so on. And then you can probably get it home. But of
Yeah.
course, it's just what you said. It's a very unsexy project because you'll be putting a lot of effort into it, a lot of money into it, and hopefully you'll get the same functionality. So
Yeah.
it's not very funny.
A
I
lot
agree.
of work, and you probably get the same thing. Yeah. Right now we're working with a customer who has a very, very old like ERP system. Third party, like it's not one of the big ones like SAP or whatever, small company. And they have an integration with Scribe, and Scribe just announced they're dropping support for that product in Dynamics and stuff in November of 2022. So they're saying you have 1 year and then we will no longer support Dynamics. And our customers freaking out. They're like, wow, so now we have to pay a lot of money within the next 12 months to get to Kingsway Soft or something else because Scribe is going away. So what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to go with Business Central. So they're going to, switch their ERP solution, which is a simple one. They're not a big company, and they're going to go with Business Central and try to take advantage of the simplicity. So the integration, instead of spending X amount to replace a complex integration to a legacy system, they think that by going to Business Central and spending the money to go there, the amount they're going to pay for the integration is less, and everything will be less complicated too. So at least with that, it's sort of like, well, since we have to pay the money anyway to fix this integration, let's do something and get some results, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to go to Business Central, and hopefully that will be better than just repairing the integration.
Yeah, and this comes back to another aspect of this that I think people need to think about, and that is there are only a very few select applications that are actually whitelisted and not and excluded from the API
That is true.
entitlement calculations. One of I think the only one that I know of, I might be wrong here, is Dynamics Marketing. So if you're using Dynamics Marketing, the conversation between like certain parts of the marketing application that are sort of like residing outside and the other parts of the Dataverse parts of marketing, those will not be counted. So you don't need that. And I mean, marketing can be very chatty. So for instance, if you're using an ISV from that perspective, that can be very complicated and a huge disadvantage for instance, Adobe Marketing or Click Dimensions that are sort of, if you're using the integration to Dynamics, they will need to push a lot of data into Dynamics and integrate with Dynamics. And I think especially if you are using Adobe Marketing for a business to consumer organization, that's going to be very heavy on the integrations. It pushes a lot of activities into the system and so on.
Email analytics, like all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff. I mean, website visits, like some of those, automatic, or whatever, marketing automation solutions do talk a lot, right, with Dynamics back and forward. So,
and currently there's no way for an ISV to bundle. So if Click Dimensions wanted to, for instance, say that, if you buy our solution, we will include 300,000 API calls, and we will include this much storage in the price if you buy this kind of level of our product.
That's not a thing.
They can't do that because there's no way of actually doing that. So it's important to understand, if you're a customer, that if you buy a product with an integration to Dynamics, that can actually cause you costs from a capacity perspective, both APIs, but then of course even storage. It might actually store quite a lot of data on your system. I noticed, for instance, another marketing application that was integrated to I think it was .digital. They have an Excel file which they upload to Dynamics, which sort of mentions all the faults in the integration.
Wow.
So then we, like, a couple of years after we installed this, we're like, what's this, like, fault.xlsx? What's that? And I found it. It's like, they created one a day for these, and it was quite large. Yeah, and it's like I just removed all of them from. I created a small job that removed all of the ones that fit the pattern, and I saved a lot of storage for that. So it's always, there can be lots of these small things that happen, and some of the applications are better at the way you can configure that, and some are not. And I think this also comes back to the refactoring question. So what can you do from a refactoring perspective? And one of the ways that we are looking at trying to fix this is by synchronizing with this Azure Synapse link to a data lake that's included in Dataverse. You can synchronize the data down to a data lake, and then we can
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, and then you can do whatever you want. You can also push the data from other systems into there.
Yeah.
You can use that data lake as a bring your own data lake into customer insight, which then can be used for instance, for Dynamics marketing to create segments.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different things that you can do with that from that perspective, like start expanding the ecosystem of your Dynamics to not just being Dataverse, but actually being a data lake as well, and then pushing that. And then I think if you want to see some of that data inside Dynamics, what you can do is that I haven't tried this myself, but my plan is that we will be using this, is to use Azure Synapse to connect to the data lake, and then using the elastic pool setting, which won't generate too much cost from what I've understood anyway. Then we can surface an OData connector to that, and then we can connect virtual tables to that. So we will get a
virtual entities. You mean
yeah,
Are they now called virtual tables?
They're called virtual tables.
They keep changing names on me.
Yeah. But that way then you can have, for instance, like archived emails.
That's right.
And those archived emails are actually they're not in Dynamics, so there will be no API calls every time you look at those, and you can do lots of stuff with that. You can also do more complex calculations, for instance, in the data lake, and then just view those through the virtual entity that's connected to the main entity, for instance. If you do that. So I think those types of refactorings are very good. From an integration perspective, if you're doing lots of integrations, I really think that you should think about the structure of what you're doing. Is there a better way to sort of handle this? I mean, generally people haven't thought about being too chatty, so by just rethinking that, maybe you can find lots of things. Also try to
and how often, right? People are like, oh, we want to check every 15 minutes. Like, why? Right? If this is something you can do in batches every night or whatever, like just that, like you said, think about doing it better, do a better job. For sure. And I think, this is a good thing for prospects out there that are watching the show or listening to this as well, to talk to the partner about, right? If they're picking a partner, like, does your partner know about all this stuff, right? I was surprised at the UG Summit. I did a session about, going from Dynamics to Power Apps to save, for companies that have complete custom solutions. They're not using any of the first-party apps. They're actually paying partners to hide all this stuff and then paying Microsoft full price and using a custom solution. So I'm like, just use Power Apps. And they are like, well, my partner never told me about Power Apps. They don't know about it. And we just went live like a month ago. This is not like I implemented 10 years ago when Power Apps didn't exist. No, this is like literally they gave me a proposal and they never talked about Power Apps. Like, they don't know. This API calls is one of those things where if you bring it up, if the company that you're talking to, which, by the way, this doesn't really apply to a lot of Dynamics partners. I think a lot of people who specialize in Dynamics, like CRM Consulterna, know about it. But this applies a lot to those shops that are like IT shops. And that when the company goes and says, do you guys do Dynamics? They're like, absolutely, we do Dynamics, right? And they do like Active Directory and Exchange and stuff like that. And they think they can do Dynamics. Well, when you bring something like this up, you're going to catch a lot of companies that think they know, but they don't really know.
Yeah, exactly. And especially many companies,
even Microsoft,
yeah. And I think many of these companies, they won't like these types of more simplistic partners, if you call them that. They won't have a problem with anything unless there's a block. And I've seen this with the team member licensing, which there were some customers that were just using team member licenses, but before there was a forceful block that didn't allow you to do the things that you and then
you could be a system admin team member.
Yeah. So we came to one of these customers and they had like just like 50, I think they had 20 or 30 just team member licenses, and we asked them like, So what's going on, guys? Like, how can you use a system? It's almost impossible to use a system with just team member licenses. And they were like, yeah,
Yeah.
well, our partner told we can do this, and we didn't have to buy the full licenses. So what are you doing? Yeah, we're actually doing opportunities, and we're doing like this and that. It's like, you can't do that.
Wow.
That's not supported. Oh, but our licensing partner said we can. Okay, but that's
Yeah.
wrong. So
Yeah, and who's your licensing partner? It's like GoDaddy, like they or like whatever. They pick some company out there that has
yeah,
nothing to do with Dynamics. So it's important. I mean, bottom line is most partners want to make sure that your investment, whatever you're paying to implement as a solution, is protected as much as we know, into the future. And B, they're going to minimize your license exposure, right? How much you're paying in licenses and API calls and extra storage and all of that, because we'd rather you spend money doing consulting, right? Doing professional service, implementing functionality. Why would we want you to pay Microsoft, triple the money that you need to pay them to use a third of the functionality, right? And by the way, Microsoft also wants you to pay for what you need to use. Like they have customer success managers that their sole job is to make sure that you're using what you're paying for and that you're not paying for stuff you don't need. So yeah, so I think that's a good approach. But once again, I wanted to make sure that we cover this topic of API calls because it came up so many times during the UG summit. So many people are concerned about it. They are really how do you call this, like hesitant to understand or agree to something like, well, they're not enforcing it anyway, so might as well go with it. They don't want to move like that. They want to be sure that they're getting something and that they're going to be protected. So, are there any other details or anything else that we missed that we need to
yeah,
share?
I want to make. I think that I'm not sure that you said it, but you might have, and then I just want to make sure that we say it the correct way. For the non-licensed users, if you
Mm-hmm.
don't have any of the enterprise or professional application licenses, or just like a Power Apps per user license, then you will just get 25,000 base calls for the app for the non-licensed users. And
Absolutely.
so if you go from the app per app user to just a dynamic sales professional, you will go from 25,000 to 500,000 API calls for that tenant. So even if
Just
you're
by having
slowing,
one license, right?
yes, exactly, and that's why you should probably, if you have it doing quite some integrations on some level, um, if you're
Just get
using
that one
Power Apps,
license.
yes, get that one license, like and Dynamics 365 Enterprise or Professional, and then you will get the full 500,000, because I mean the advantage, the alternative would be to actually buy. What would be it would be
Those
like something like,
50,000, that you mentioned
yeah, so
about.
it would be like 12 or 13 of these that you need
Yeah.
to buy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's always useful to have at least one user license with a bunch of functionality, because the other advantage, and I don't want to turn this into a licensing episode. The other advantage with getting a user that has one of those enterprise licenses or whatever is that as soon as you have a user that is licensed to use first party functionality, you can surface that first party functionality to uh, basically Power App users. It will be read only. They cannot create or write or do anything with it, but you can surface it to them. So, like for example, we have customers that are paying for field service, right? The full-on first-party app, and they can surface work orders to people that have Power App licenses. They can read it, so they can go to the account record, for example, and there will be a grid in there with like any work orders that are open. They cannot do anything with them, but at least I can see that there's work orders that are open. So I'm about to call this customer, and they're gonna bring this up, right? So if you have licensed users on those apps, like you have a user that has enterprise and you got it because you get that 500,000 API calls, then you can also read all the other stuff that guy can read. So there are more advantages to it than having one. And I even told people, customers, and I don't know if you did this trick, the customers that get all their licenses through a CSP, a cloud solution provider, I always said it's like go and get at least one license through Microsoft, right? Just outside of your CSP, get a license. Why? Because it comes with free support from Microsoft, right? Not every CSP out there has great dynamic support because there are CSPs for Azure and Office, and they sell everything. And when you call them with a problem for Dynamics, they don't know what they're doing. So I always tell people, it's like, just go and get a $20, power out whatever license for Dynamics directly from Microsoft with your credit card. And now you can open tickets with
Yes.
Microsoft. They don't
Exactly.
ask.
Yeah.
They don't ask which user is it to make sure that the license is a CSP. They don't care. They don't care who it is. Now you can open tickets. So there's a lot of
I,
sketchy
I, I,
pro
I
moves.
I actually did that with a team member license for a customer. They
There
have
you go.
they have like several hundred other licenses through EA and through their CSP. But then we just bought one team member license, and all the gates open for the support creating support tickets. So that
Unlimited.
was yeah, that's today's life hack,
Unlimited.
right?
I feel like we can do an episode on just pro life hacks of the
Yeah, we can, yeah.
licensing and free support and stuff like. How do you get free stuff? Um, which I
Or
think will be a pretty popular episode.
probably,
I
yeah.
this is and now I'm having ideas for like a future conference. Like this could be a cool topic for a conference. But anyway, Gustav, anything else that we should add before we wrap this one up?
No, I don't think so. Not at this time. Do go into and have a look at this. I've written some of this about on my blog. It's
Yes.
powerplatform.se. So you can have a look there and read and learn more about it. And also I've linked to the documents on Microsoft at Microsoft Docs. You can, if you just search for like Dataverse entitlements limits, you will get there because there's like it will point there. So it's not
For
very hard
sure.
to find. But
For sure.
remember, the limits are on the Dataverse level. It's actually not Dynamics. And it's not Power Platform per se. It's actually Dataverse. So
Yeah.
just to be sure about that. And
Yep.
then if you are over 10 million, if you are one of those few customers, do talk to your account manager. What I've heard is that it should be possible to sort of do things about this, but
Yeah.
you need to understand what's going on first. So that's, I
And
think,
then tell us what Microsoft said. Like I'm interested. I don't have
yeah,
any customer that is over 10 million. So,
yeah,
if that's one of you, shoot us an email and tell us what happened. Because I'm interested in knowing what happened and we'll share with other people. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Gustav, for all the insight and all the details. Hopefully, we clear some of those questions out there, concerns
yes,
from people
yeah,
that are afraid about these API calls. It's not a big deal. It will probably not apply to you if you're listening to this show. But if it does, talk to Microsoft and then tell us what they said because we're curious.
yes,
Uh,
we are.
Absolutely. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you guys in the next one.